Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And a very big special welcome to Dr. Helen Lawlor and to Dubh Linn. We are absolutely delighted, and you're in for a treat. The rehearsals earlier were fantastic, so you're really going to enjoy it. And it's a very special evening because we're delighted to have with us the Mayor of Cap d'Aille, Monsieur Beck, and his adjoint, Helena. And we are following on from their discovery of Dubh Linn, with several years of doing a wonderful concert at St. Patrick's Day, which Prince Albert attended last year. So we're delighted. So the lecture tonight by Helen is thanks to the support of the Irish Research Council. And Dr. Lawlor is the recipient of an award from the council, allowing her to visit the Princess Grace Library here in Monaco and undertake research on the Princess Grace Irish-American music collection. A talented harpist, Helen specialises in research on music with a focus on the musical practice, education and history of the harp. She lectures in music at TU Dublin Conservatoire, where she also obtained her Bachelor in Music Education jointly from Trinity, and is actually organising a symposium on June 8th, which is a lot of hard work for you, Helen. And that is open to the public, so if you're in Dublin, please attend, and you'll hear more about the 100 years of history of the Princess Grace music collection that we have here. So Helen's lecture tonight on the music and symbolism of the Irish harp and its rich history will draw on her research from her published books, her PhD from UCD, Masters in Musicology from UCD, the knowledge garnered from the many hats that she wears, such as, I'll just name one or two, executive editor of the Journal of the Society of Musicology in Ireland. And she has shared her research both nationally and internationally, lecturing at Harvard University, Boston College, New York, Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and that's only a few. So we won't take up too much time because we're delighted to have the lecture and the music tonight. So as well as all that, Helen is a member of Dubh Linn and will be performing tonight. So I'd like to thank Helen, Ado, Fanula, Ray and Conor for volunteering to come and share their music with us. And I'll let you guess which musician Helen is most in tune with, because she's married to one of the guys, but I won't tell you which one.
I'd be out of tune.
Enjoy this evening.
Thank you, Paula, for that very kind and generous introduction. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to share my research and our music with you today. The journey to this lecture started just over a year ago when I was first introduced to the song sheet collection here at the library. And this collection of songs dates from 1840 to about 1940 and was acquired by Princess Grace in 1977 from Michael E. O'Donnell of Philadelphia. It's a fascinating collection, and I was immediately drawn to the rich stories it tells of Irish music, imagery, emigration, nostalgia, politics, and daily life in America. Most of the songs are written from an Irish-American perspective and provide insightful scholarly resources to researchers. I cannot imagine the potential loss to future researchers had this collection not been preserved so carefully. After an initial visit to study the collection, which was catalogued by my friend and former colleague Fintan Vallely, I realised this would make for an inspirational way to create new knowledge about Irish music in America in the 20th century. I was honoured to receive an IRC, Irish Research Council, New Foundations Award in partnership with the ITMA, that's the Irish Traditional Music Archive, to support my research. And this grant has allowed me further time to study here and dig deeper into the collection. As part of this, yesterday I had the great honour of teaching the harp at the Rainier Trois Academy with Noelle, Vera and her students. In June, as I said, Paula said, we'll have the symposium on the 8th of June entitled Irish American Music Cultures, also inspired by the collection here. Following that, my Dubh Linn colleagues and I will be heading into the studio with Grammy Award-winning engineer Ben Rawlins to record some of the repertoire for the collection. This will be made available on the ITMA website as a teaching resource for secondary schools in Ireland working on Irish music in America, which is part of the Leaving Cert curriculum. I'm immensely grateful to Paula and the trustees of the library for the support of this work. I mentioned my Dubh Linn colleagues, Ado, Ray, Fanula and Conor today, who have travelled over to, and we're going to play some pieces from the collection throughout the lecture. So the harp in music, literature and culture. The harp is at once a symbol of Ireland and a musical instrument. It has occupied a place in the Irish psyche for centuries, both musically and ideologically. An identifiably Irish instrument, its repertoire and style has provenance in Ireland to at least the 9th century AD, thus bolstering its importance in terms of cultural and ideological associations. Beginning with the role of the harp in Irish mythology, this lecture will trace the changing nature and descriptions of the Irish harp through its history in myth, poetry, literature and music into the present day. The lecture is divided into 3 main sections: myth, dealing with accounts of the harp in folklore and folk tales; poetry and painting, including the work of Sidney Owenson, Thomas Moore and Daniel Macleese; and finally in music. The most likely origin of the harp is eastward travel from Egypt before the 9th century. However, we can't let the truth get in the way of a good story. In Irish mythology, we have invented what we call an origin myth of the origin of the harp. And this was documented in Eugene O'Curry's 1873 book on the manners and customs of the ancient Irish. And this story is about a married couple, but all was not. It wasn't a paradise garden. The wife had grown to hate her husband and kept running away from him through wildernesses and through woods. And one day she was walking on the seashore of Camas Beach. And this is a quote from O'Curry. And she was walking over the strand. She met a skeleton of a whale on the strand, and she heard the sounds of the wind passing through the sinews of the whale on the strand, and she fell asleep from the sounds. And her husband came after her and found her asleep. And he perceived that it was from the sounds of the harp that the sleep fell upon her. And he went forward into the wood and made the form of the crit, this is the Irish word for harp, and he put strings from the sinews of the whale into it, and that was the first crit that was ever made. Maybe not quite factual, but important figures in Irish mythology also played the harp. Irish mythology was passed down for centuries through the oral tradition, and in it we learn stories of great battles, of Irish warriors and magical gods. The Dagda was a sun deity of the ancient Celts, and he was one of the Tuatha De Danann, and he lived at the tumulus of Newgrange. So for those of you that don't know, so I have 2 pictures here. On the one on my left is the outside view of Newgrange in County Meath, and then the other picture is the inner chamber, which on the winter solstice the sun lights up the entire inner chamber, and this was built during the Celtic times. So it's an amazing feat of architecture linked to the direction of the sun. So again, maybe not quite factual, but this is where Dagda lived as a harper. The Tuatha De Danann were constantly in battle. And one story, the Battle of Moytira, and these are remains at Moytira. The Dagda was in a battle with his enemies, and he had bound some magic into his harp as a reserve weapon. And the harp was hanging on a wall in the chamber in Moytira. So he chanted to the harp, "Come summer, come winter, from the mouths of harps and bags and pipes." And with that chant, the harp flew from the wall and killed 9 men on its way to the Dagda's hands. You have to be careful. You have to be careful. Another mythic harper was Lu. And Lu was welcomed to the High King's residence at the hill of Tara. And he was welcomed because of his talent. He was known as a Saul Dánach, which was the name given to one who was the master of all the arts, including the harp. Such stories of magic and fairies abound in Irish culture. Indeed, there are many accounts into the 20th century of supernatural encounters with fairies and mythic beings. So our first song today from the Princess Grace Song Sheet collection tells of one such encounter. A man out walking and taking a shortcut is tricked by a beautiful fairy who steals his heart, leaving a stone in its place. Fearing she will also steal his soul, he vows never to take the shortcut again. And this is our arrangement of Shortcut to the Rosses. And Ray, maybe you'd like to say a couple of words about the Rosses?
Yeah, the Rosses is an area of on the west side, the midwest side of County Donegal, which is northwest of Ireland. And the Rosses and that whole area of Donegal is awash with, down through the years, it's been a rich area of Irish traditional music, and in particular fiddle players. And there was one such fiddle player, the late John Doherty. He was a very famous player, and he claims, he was born in 1900, but he claims to have learned all his music from the fairies. So to quote from Helen's earlier on, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. But so just beware of the shortcut to the Rosses.
One, two, three, four.
soul and crush it like a dead leaf in her hand. For the shortcut to the cross is the way to fairyland. The way to fairyland.
Moving away from mythology to early Gaelic Ireland, we find that there is actual evidence of harp playing in Ireland from the 9th century onwards. Early Christian stone crosses, such as show the uniquely Irish triangular harp, or crit in Irish, such as this example of the Murdoch stone cross at Monaster Boyce. So when the harp travelled eastward from Egypt initially, it was in the form of a lyre, which is kind of a rectangular shape, and in Ireland it gradually became a triangular harp and stayed as a triangular harp in Ireland. So this is one of the first examples that we have. Now when I zoom in, it's a little bit blurry, but here, where's our little pointer, you can see this is the triangular harp here on carved into the stone cross here. So this is it's amazing how it has survived the Irish weather for so many centuries. A similar example is the beautiful shrine of the Stowe Missal, which is now housed at the National Museum of Ireland. The harp was held in very high esteem in ancient Gaelic Ireland. Irish chieftains ruled, protecting their territories through battles with neighbouring chieftains. They collectively ruled under a system of law known as the Brehon laws, with the High King of Ireland residing at Tara. The harper, known as the critura, was second in the court of the chieftain only to the poet or the filla. They played on beautifully carved wire-strung harps, such as this surviving example housed at Trinity College Dublin. These harps were generally about 30 centimetres in height, hollowed out of a single piece of willow, and they were strung with brass strings, giving a beautiful long resonance to each note, and were played by plucking the strings with long fingernails in the manner of a plectrum. And you can see here on this harp that there are beautiful carvings all along the harp, and also at the top this hollow apparently had quite a large emerald in it. Yeah, so I'd like one of those, Ado, for my harp. The harpers were privileged, and they were protected in law through exemptions from taxes, with special property and clothing rights, as an excerpt from the Brehon law explains. This is the only profession of music which is entitled to be ennobled, which is entitled to enechland, a fine in right of insult to the honour, as well as to personal injury of the performer. An 11th century monk, Giraldus Cambrensis, wrote in his Topographica Hibernica about the uncultured manners and customs of the Irish, and he was part of the Norman conquest of Ireland, and in his research travelled all around Ireland writing about the manners and customs. However, the only aspect of Irish life that he valued was the ancient harping tradition. And I'm reading the text here that's on the slide. It is only in the case of musical instruments that I find commendable diligence among these people. On them they are incomparably more skilled than any people we have seen. It is remarkable how, with such rapid finger work, the rhythm of the music is maintained. So subtly do they approach their rhythmic patterns, they freely play the tinkling sounds on the thinner strings above the sustained tone of the thicker strings. They take such secret delight and caress the string so sensuously that the most important element in their art appears to be in veiling it, as if it were better for being hidden. Art revealed brings shame. With the advent of the Norman invasion of Ireland in the late 12th century, the old system of Gaelic chieftains was gradually replaced by a new ruling class of Anglo-Irish aristocrats. The fate of the harper, and indeed Gaelic Ireland, was immortalised in Daniel MacLeese's spectacular painting of monumental proportions, The Marriage of Strongbow and Aoife, and this is now housed in the National Gallery of Ireland. And in this painting we have the harper lamenting here, the old harper lamenting the loss of Gaelic Ireland. We have the Normans in full strength with the dying Irish. Now this is much later than the Norman conquest, but it gives very good imagery, and as a painting it is spectacular in terms of its size, and it's on permanent display in the National Gallery. A common phrase in the analysis of Irish history is that the first Normans became as Irish as the Irish themselves. And for centuries, they did continue to support Gaelic harpers. Aristocratic landowners of both Catholic, Gaelic and Protestant English origins supported harpers by welcoming them as esteemed guests into their stately homes. Many attempts to free Ireland from English influence, however, followed the Norman invasion. In Ulster, significant portions of land were taken over from the Irish by a programme of plantation. The Earls of Ulster, Hugh O'Donnell and Red Hugh O'Neill sought help from Spain at the end of the 16th century. Following a defeat in the Battle of Kinsale, the Irish Earls left for Europe, and as part of the Battle of Kinsale, many French ships and battalions were sent, and we were speaking the other night with a man from Villefranche-sur-Mer, and there's a replica of a boat that was shipwrecked in Ireland in Villefranche-sur-Mer. So we were fascinated to come across this. Following the defeat in the Battle of Kinsale, Irish earls left for Europe to try and enlist the help of Catholic monarchies on the continent for the Irish cause. Many Irish soldiers left to support the French army against a war with Britain. They became known as the regiments of the wild geese, often using the Irish harp as the symbol on their flag. And this is a flag that was preserved from a monastery in Ypres and brought back to Kylemore Abbey and is on display there. So now I'm going to play a tune for you. This is a tune called The Wild Geese. It's a slow air on the harp, and it symbolises the rolling waves and the Irish, young men, Gaelic Irish, sailing away from Ireland, and the flight of the Earls also, which effectively left Ireland without Gaelic leadership. The harping tradition continued through the centuries, although harpers were no longer under the patronage of the Gaelic chieftains, but became a type of high-level travelling musician. They visited the great houses of the Anglo-Irish and were received as honoured guests. Ireland had become an aristocratic society with the centuries-old tradition of the big house. And the big house was a country mansion inhabited by a member of the landed gentry and their staff. And these were both in Catholic and Protestant ownership. Writer Donal O'Sullivan describes, as far as the gentry was concerned, the harp was the principal musical instrument. The harpers were a numerous class and they were entertained as guests at the big houses. They were much in request on special occasions such as weddings and funerals, and in return received that lavish hospitality for which Ireland has always been famous. Instrumental tunes composed by harpers were known as planxties, and these are tunes in honour of a patron. One of the most famous harper composers of the 17th century was the blind harper Turlough Carolyn. He composed over 200 tunes, many of which are still in the repertory. And one such of these is Madam Maxwell, and this was composed by Turlough Carolyn in the music room of Farnham House in County Cavan. So this is Farnham House here, which is still standing and is now a part of a hotel in County Cavan, very beautiful hotel where myself and Ado hosted our wedding reception, and only found out on the day that that's where Madam Maxwell had been composed, so I was delighted with that. And then I also wanted to show you this picture. This is Kinure House in Rush in County Dublin, but the difference between these two buildings is that Kinure House now only exists as the portico, because the house was badly damaged by fire in the 1980s, and it was under the ownership then of Fingal County Council, and the house had to be destroyed. So it's now just the portico, which is a really strange echo of that old part of Irish history. So we're going to play Madam Maxwell for you. This is one of these the tunes, one of the planxty tunes, and then we'll move on to one of the songs shortly. A relatively near contemporary and predecessor of Turlough Carolyn was Ruaidhrí Dáil Ó Cathain. He was also a blind harper who lived from 1546 to 1653, and he spent much of his time in Scotland, where he composed the famous tune Tuaireann the Love, or Give Me Your Hand, which was actually made famous by the band Planxty. I was thrilled to find an arrangement of one of Ruaidhrí Dáil's tunes in the Princess Grace song sheet collection here in the library. This tune likely dates back to some time in the mid-16th to early 17th century, and in this example it was arranged by Charlotte Milligan Fox and set to beautiful poetry. And Milligan writes, "The air is attributed to one of the greatest Ulster harpers, Ruaidhrí Dáil Ó Cathain, who after the downfall of Hugh O'Neill resided principally in Scotland. He played before James VI of that kingdom, later the first of England. He died around 1650 at Castle Eglinton in extreme old age. So this tune is called Farewell My Gentle Harp. Edo, would you like to introduce this?
Well, of course. So in this song, one of the big features of traditional Irish songs is the emotion that the song carries. And as Helen has described of harpers, the harp and the harpist are very much intertwined. And in this song, the sentiment is brought beautifully to life, but where, in an unusual twist perhaps, where it is set just before his passing, and he talks about and describes his harp, and effectively having brought so much magic to the world through his harping. His wish upon his passing is that nobody plays his harp after he's gone. so it's a strange twist, but a very beautiful song. And if you can imagine the emotion of it, it's very powerful. Farewell, my gentle harp, farewell. My master's toils are nearly o'er. These chords
By the end of the 18th century, the harp tradition had fallen into a steep decline. Musically and socially, the Irish harp had started to become left behind as a relic of a past musical and social age. The chieftains of Gaelic Ireland had lost any remaining vestiges of power, and their court system belonged to a different time. Several efforts to revive the tradition were staged in the late 18th century, most notably the Belfast Harp Festival of 1792. This was held at the Linen Hall Library in Belfast to coincide with the United Irishmen's celebration of Bastille Day. While antiquarian efforts to revive the harp did not result in the musical revival that was hoped for, the harp at the same time became a vital visual symbol of Irishness, associated with Irish nationalists who sought independence from England. The symbol of the harp carried its ancient Gaelic and noble history. The fact that it had fallen into decline further helped its symbolic associations. The United Irishmen, led by Wolfe Tone, aimed to achieve Catholic emancipation and parliamentary reform, and their motto was, "It is new, strong, and shall be heard." And this was presented alongside the uncrowned harp, a symbol of Irish freedom for centuries to come. In 1798, the United Irishmen led a major uprising against British rule in Ireland, and while that in itself was not a success, it did inspire subsequent generations to take up that cause. In poetry and literature, the harp found a place as a malleable trope for romanticism and nationalism. Mary Louise O'Donnell describes how Sidney Owenson, for example, places the harp as a central device in her novel The Wild Irish Girl. And O'Donnell writes, "For Owenson, the instrument could be a dynamic utopian icon, serving to rally Ireland as a nation ready to look forward to the future." Owenson, in the guise of her main character, Gloravina, enthusiastically assumed the role of harper, both literally and figuratively. The harp in literature becomes increasingly distant from contemporary performance practice over the course of the early to mid-19th century, a separation that allowed for poetic imaginings of the harp to represent ideology rather than music. Thomas Moore, the famous Irish poet, celebrated and romanticised the harp in his Irish Melodies. The melodies are poems by Moore set to Irish tunes, many of which were collected by harpers at the Belfast Harp Festival of 1792 that was on our previous slide, and these had been collected and published by Edward Bunting. 3 of Moore's poems in particular show how the harp in Moore's writing becomes immortalised for its symbolism. In The Minstrel Boy, from Volume 5 of the Irish Melodies, published in 1811, the brave minstrel marches to war with his wild harp slung behind him, and after his capture he preserves the virtue of the harp and its symbolic home. The minstrel fell, but the foeman's chain could not bring that proud soul under. The harp he loved ne'er spoke again, for he tore its cords asunder, and said, "No chains shall sully thee, thy soul of love and bravery. Thy songs were made for the pure and free, they shall never sound in slavery." By contrast, Moore's Dear Harp of My Country, the harp now meets a sorrowful, if more peaceful end. The cold chain of silence had hung o'er thee long, and go sleep with the sunshine of fame on thy slumbers, till touched by some less unworthy hand than mine. If the pulse of the patriot, soldier, or lover have throbbed at our lay, 'tis thy glory alone. I was but as the wind, passing heedlessly over, and all the wild sweetness I waked was thy own. Following the 1798 United Irishmen's Rebellion, Thomas Moore visited Kilmainham Jail to see Edward Hudson, who was imprisoned there. Linda Kelly describes that, and I quote, "Moore showed courage in going to visit Hudson in Kilmainham Jail. A good painter as well as a musician, Hudson had whiled away his time making a large charcoal drawing of the mythical origins of the Irish harp on his wall of his cell. Moore used the subject, the sea nymph who falls vainly in love with a mortal and is transformed into a harp, for one of his Irish melodies, the origin of the harp. So we now have a new origin myth for the harp. It's not a whale, but now it is a type of mermaid creature who has come out of the water, and after falling in love with a mortal, so the opposite to the shortcut to the Rosses, she is turned into a harp. 'Tis believed that this harp which I wake now for thee was a siren of old who sung under the sea, and who often at eve through the bright waters roved to meet on the green shore a youth whom she loved. But she loved him in vain, for he left her to weep, and in tears all the night her gold tresses to steep, till heaven looked with pity on true love so warm, and changed to this soft harp the sea maiden's form. Still her bosom rose fair, still her cheeks smiled the same, while her sea beauties gracefully formed the light, and her hair, as let loose o'er her white arm it fell, was changed to bright chords, uttering melody's spell. Hence it came that this soft harp so long hath been known to mingle love's language with sorrow's sad tone, till thou didst divide them and teach the fond lay to speak love when I'm near thee and grief went away. Moore, inspired by Hudson, reinvents the origin of the harp, still emerging from the sea, but now as a beautiful sea maiden, no longer man-made but divinely created. She is an elusive and tragic figure who is immortalized as the harp. The poetry created by Moore was then realized visually by painter Daniel Maclise, who illustrated Moore's poem in 1842 in his painting The Origin of the Harp. Into the later 19th century, the harp was at such a particularly low ebb that its presence in literature and poetry becomes further distant from any musical awakenings to a deeply symbolic role. The harp becomes the languishing Ireland, the faithful Kathleen Niulicán, glorified in poetry, song and literature of Ireland, and indeed the diaspora. The developments in instrument making were most notable in those harps produced by John Egan of Dublin, and these were coupled with its representation in poetry, literature and art, created a radically different musical reality for the instrument. The harp in the 19th century became popular as a drawing room instrument, echoing the context of the European pedal harp, as it gave a bourgeois respectability to the instrument. It became to be considered ladylike, a transformation that began in pedal harping when Marie Antoinette took up the harp in France, and its popularity spread throughout the European drawing rooms. A harp maker in Dublin, John Egan, transformed the construction of the harp, making it easier to play contemporary music, and both Sidney Owenson and Thomas Moore played these harps. This is an example of the Egan harp. An event of catastrophic significance to Irish culture was the famine of the 1840s. Over 1 million Irish emigrated, a vast majority of those to the United States. They travelled across the Atlantic in famine ships, enduring appalling conditions. The first generation of Irish emigrants arrived in a state of poverty and starvation. However, the plight of the Irish in America brought mixed fortunes. Initially, the Irish had occasionally and often been looked down upon, particularly in terms of antisocial habits and stereotypes of overindulging in alcohol. Emily Cullen argues in her essay in Harp Studies that, and I quote, written and visual accounts of the Irish at this time highlighted their intemperance and poverty. The caricature cartoons depicted a riotous simian-like Paddy clay pipe clenched between his teeth, or his female equivalent, Bridget. And I found this excellent example of this very type of visual imagery in the song sheet collection here. So in this comic song, Danny McGann argues that the brewers refuse to give him credit, but that won't stop him. So you have to listen to the song to find out how he gets about this particular conundrum. I can confirm that no Dubh Linn members would ever drink stale beer. Unless they were very, very thirsty. The type of visual imagery in that song and in this song sheet was a popular one at the time in both the American and British cartoon press. However, not all songs were disparaging, and Emily Cullen argues that the harp helped to create a far more positive image of the Irish in America, particularly when joined with temperance movements. And I quote, "A large portion of the Irish population actively identified with the green harp flag during the 19th century. The culture around the harp symbol at this time suggests that it had become a source of pride for Irish everywhere, as evidence of a golden age of pre-Christian Gaelic civility, and that by the middle of the century, all classes of Irish people were able to read the sign of the harp as a reminder of the glorious heritage." And she adds, "It's clear that the symbol of the Irish national harp played a prominent role in the cultivation of the image of a distinct society of new Irish Americans who were keen to identify as respectable citizens. Ultimately, it can be argued that the success of the Irish in their adopted countries was inextricably linked with the conscious and strategic application of the harp icon." This rethinking of the Irish in America as respectable citizens, industrious and latterly politically powerful, is evident in song too. That history in song is another day's work, but we would like to share with you one example of a popular song type written from an American perspective, with the Irish Colleen as a desirable young woman, a far cry from the ape-like cartoons. Here, the woman in question is Dolly from Dublin, one of the songs from the song sheet collection.
Just pick out the nearest of girls and the sweetest of roses.
By the early 20th century, the Irish harp was at a very low ebb in Ireland, with only a minimal number of active harpists. The Irish harp and European pedal harps were considered to be an appropriate instrument for young ladies to play, and they began to be taught in a new context, so no longer the Gaelic court, but convent schools, with Loreto Abbey, Rathfarnham and Dominican College Sion Hill in Dublin emerging as centres for harping. This context intensified the female uptake of the harp as women teachers taught girl students, so that by the second and third decades of the 20th century, there is minimal evidence of male performers. In the mid-century, the revival of the harping tradition was pioneered by a number of visionary harpists, including sisters Maureen and Roisin Ní Hay, Sheila Larche Cuthbert, and Grania Yeats, who was daughter-in-law of poet W.B. Yeats. Maureen Ní Hay was teacher to singer and harpist Mary O'Hara. Mary O'Hara toured the world, selling out venues such as the Albert Hall in London and Carnegie Hall in New York, with her performances of Irish song to harp accompaniment. Her papers are housed at the Burns Library in Boston College, and I was privileged to previously have received funding to study these papers for my research for my book, Harp Studies. And interestingly, Mary also gave a lecture and a performance here in 2013 at the library. Following her stellar career, the harp went through a widespread revival from the 1960s onwards. Societies including Crit Éireann, the Belfast Harp Orchestra, Cordia na Critche, the Historical Harp Society of Ireland, Music Generation and Cultus Culture Ireland have all contributed to the harp's resurgence. Today, the harp in Ireland is experiencing unprecedented levels of popularity. It has been inscribed on the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage for Ireland, giving international recognition to its musical and symbolic importance. The harp abounds in traditional music and is played in classical and early music contexts too. One of the great outcomes of the harp revival is that the harp has become integrated into traditional music practice, where harpers play both melody and accompaniment to traditional music tunes such as reels and jigs, and we will finish with a set of tunes in a moment. The harp in Ireland has had a long and fraught history. It was exalted in mythology and cherished in early Gaelic Ireland. During the period of colonisation, the harp remained musically important, retaining for the most part its cultural prestige. When the decline of the harping tradition set in, it became immortalised in poetry, literature and painting, becoming a vibrant symbol of Ireland that could mean many things, but mostly liberty and independence in the context of a rich Gaelic past. Musically, the harp has been restrung and is heard. Thank you very much. So before I finish, I would like Paula to present you on behalf of the library this copy. So I took one of the harp tunes from, or one of the tunes from the collection, and I arranged it for the Rainier Trois Harp Ensemble and gave a copy of this to Noelle yesterday. So I'd like to also give the library a copy and to say thank you for accommodating us for today, and thank you to our audience. So we'll finish with one set of tunes now, and then I believe there's a whole table full of not stale beer outside.